The first thing Elena noticed that morning was the silence, the kind that pressed against the walls of the penthouse like it was listening, waiting, the kind that only existed in places owned by powerful men who controlled everything down to the air itself, and she had learned over the past year that silence around Matteo DeLuca was never peaceful, it was loaded, dangerous, and full of meaning, yet she moved through the marble-floored apartment anyway, barefoot, careful, her phone in her hand as sunlight spilled through the tall windows overlooking Manhattan, the city alive below while her world remained tightly caged above it, because loving, or being claimed by, a mafia boss was not love in the normal sense, it was possession wrapped in protection, luxury mixed with fear, and rules that were never fully spoken but always enforced, and Elena had learned those rules the hard way, especially the one about attention, because Matteo DeLuca did not share what he considered his, and everyone in New York knew that his temper was as legendary as his power, though with her he rarely raised his voice, which somehow made it worse, because when Matteo was calm, things happened quietly, permanently, without witnesses. She paused by the kitchen island, scrolling absent-mindedly, when the notification appeared, a message request from a number she didn't recognize, just a simple reaction to a photo she had posted the night before, a candid shot at a charity event Matteo himself had insisted she attend, dressed in black silk, smiling politely for donors she barely knew, and the reaction was small, almost meaningless to anyone else, just a single fire emoji fire, nothing flirtatious, nothing explicit, but Elena felt a strange flicker in her chest anyway, not excitement exactly, more like nostalgia for a life where something so harmless didn't carry consequences, where a stranger's attention was just that, harmless, and without thinking too deeply, she locked her phone and slipped it into her hand as Matteo entered the room behind her, his presence announced not by sound but by instinct, her shoulders tightening before she even turned, because Matteo DeLuca filled space without trying, tall, immaculately dressed even at home, dark eyes sharp with calculation, a man who had built an empire on control and bloodless smiles, and who now watched her with the same intensity he once reserved for rivals. "You're up early," he said calmly, pouring himself coffee like the penthouse wasn't wired with cameras, like his men weren't stationed on every floor below, like Elena wasn't the most guarded woman in the city without ever asking to be, and she nodded, forcing a small smile. Couldn't sleep, which wasn't a lie, because sleep came in fragments these days, interrupted by dreams where doors slammed and phones rang and Matteo looked at her with that quiet expression that meant something irreversible was about to happen. They ate breakfast in near silence, Matteo scrolling through messages on his tablet, Elena staring out at the skyline, and for a moment she allowed herself to pretend they were normal, just another powerful businessman and his girlfriend in a luxury apartment, until Matteo's gaze shifted, subtle but precise, landing not on her face but on the phone beside her plate, and her heart skipped, because she had forgotten how little escaped his notice. "You're popular," he said lightly, setting the tablet down, and she frowned. "What do you mean?" Trying to keep her tone casual, but Matteo was already reaching for her phone, not aggressively, not asking, simply taking it as if it belonged to him by default, which in his world it did, and she felt a cold line trace her spine as he unlocked it with the code he had insisted on knowing months ago, for her safety, scrolling with practiced ease until he stopped, eyes narrowing just enough for her to recognize the shift, the moment the fire emoji came into view, bright and small and suddenly catastrophic, and for a second Matteo said nothing, the room holding its breath, Elena watching his reflection in the glass, seeing not anger but calculation, which scared her more. "Who is this?" he asked quietly, and she swallowed. "I don't know, just someone from the event, probably," because the truth, that she hadn't even replied, felt irrelevant in the face of his gaze, and Matteo hummed thoughtfully, thumb hovering over the screen. "Interesting," he murmured, then finally looked at her, really looked at her, his eyes dark, unreadable, and when he spoke again his voice was calm, almost gentle, the kind of tone that made men disappear and organizations collapse. "Block him," he said simply, handing the phone back to her like he was returning something insignificant, and Elena hesitated for half a second too long, long enough for Matteo to tilt his head, not in anger, but expectation, and she realized then that this wasn't about the emoji, not really, it was about control, about lines drawn in invisible ink, about the fact that in Matteo DeLuca's world, even the smallest flame could start a war, and as her finger hovered over the screen, blocking a stranger she would never meet, Elena felt something shift deep inside her, because if one fire emoji could cause this, she wondered what would happen when something real threatened to burn. Elena pressed the block button with a hand that barely trembled, more out of instinct than obedience, because survival around Matteo DeLuca depended on understanding when resistance was useless, and the phone felt heavier afterward, like it carried a consequence rather than a choice. Yet Matteo only nodded once, satisfied, already mentally moving on as if the matter were settled forever, which should have reassured her but didn't, because Matteo never truly let things go. He archived them, stored them away like weapons for future use, and as he finished his coffee and left the penthouse without another word, Elena stood alone in the silence again, replaying the moment over and over, wondering why such a small interaction had stirred something so deep in her chest, a mix of fear, resentment, and a quiet, dangerous curiosity about the boundaries of her cage. The rest of the day unfolded under watchful eyes, Matteo's men escorting her to a designer fitting she hadn't asked for, then to lunch at a private members-only restaurant where everyone knew her name but no one knew her, and she smiled politely, answered harmless questions, and pretended not to notice the way conversations paused when she walked by, because being attached to Matteo DeLuca meant you were both admired and feared, a beautiful warning sign, and yet beneath the surface of luxury, Elena felt restless, her thoughts drifting back to the fire emoji, not because of the sender but because it represented something forbidden, spontaneous, uncontrolled, the opposite of everything Matteo was, and when she finally returned to the penthouse that evening, the city glowing gold outside the windows, she found Matteo already there, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, speaking quietly into his phone in Italian, his voice low and lethal, and she caught fragments she didn't fully understand but felt anyway, words about territory, disrespect, and consequences, and her stomach tightened as she realized, with a chill, that his mood from the morning hadn't passed, it had evolved. He ended the call as she approached, eyes flicking to her face, searching for something. "How was your day?" he asked, and she shrugged lightly. "Fine," because honesty was a currency she spent carefully now, and he studied her for a moment before nodding, satisfied or pretending to be, and poured her a glass of wine, a gesture that might have looked tender to an outsider but felt calculated to her, a way of keeping her calm, anchored, and as they sat together on the couch, Matteo's arm resting around her shoulders like a claim, Elena felt the tension coil tighter when his phone buzzed, and this time she couldn't ignore the shift in his body, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the stillness that preceded violence. "We have a problem," he said finally, standing and pacing slowly, and Elena's heart thudded. "What kind of problem?" she asked, knowing better than to press but unable to stop herself, and Matteo exhaled through his nose. "Someone at the charity event asked questions about you," he said, turning to look at her, eyes sharp, not just admiration. Curiosity. The wrong kind, and she swallowed. "About me." Her voice small, because suddenly the emoji didn't feel harmless anymore, and Matteo nodded. "You don't belong to that world anymore," he said firmly, not cruelly but absolutely. People need to understand that, and the words settled heavily between them, because Elena realized then that Matteo didn't see her as a person being questioned, but as territory being surveyed, and that night, when they went to bed, his touch was possessive rather than affectionate, his hands grounding her, reminding her of where she was, and Elena let him, because resisting would only escalate things she wasn't ready to face, but sleep refused to come, and as Matteo eventually drifted off beside her, breathing slow and steady like a man who feared nothing, Elena stared at the ceiling, wondering who exactly had been asking about her and why, and whether blocking one stranger had already set off a chain reaction she couldn't stop. The answer came the next morning in the form of an envelope slipped under the penthouse door, unmarked, heavy, and when Elena found it, her pulse spiked, because nothing arrived here without purpose, and inside was a single photograph from the charity event, zoomed in, precise, showing her laughing at something just out of frame, her body angled slightly away from Matteo, and on the back, written in neat handwriting, were 3 words that made her blood run cold. "Fire suits you," and in that moment, Elena understood with terrifying clarity that the emoji hadn't been the end of the story at all, it had been the beginning. Elena stood frozen in the foyer with the photograph trembling between her fingers, the city's distant noise humming through the glass like nothing in the world had changed, even though hers had just tilted sharply off balance, because the message on the back of the photo wasn't a threat exactly, it was worse, it was confidence, the kind that came from someone who believed they were untouchable or deliberately trying to prove they weren't afraid of Matteo DeLuca, and fear crept up her spine as she realized that whoever had sent it knew where she lived, knew how to bypass security, knew enough to make a point without revealing themselves, and when Matteo emerged from the bedroom moments later, adjusting his cufflinks with habitual precision, he read her expression instantly, crossing the room in 2 long strides and taking the photo from her hand before she could say a word, his eyes scanning it once, then again, lingering on the handwriting, and Elena watched his face carefully, expecting anger, explosion, violence, but what she saw instead was focus, razor sharp and chillingly calm, the look of a man switching into strategy mode. Did anyone else see this? He asked, already moving, already thinking 10 steps ahead, and she shook her head, barely finding her voice. It was just there, and Matteo nodded slowly, folding the photograph once and slipping it into his pocket like a receipt, something to be dealt with later. Good, he said quietly, that means it was meant for us, and the casual way he said it made her stomach twist, because in Matteo's world, messages like this were invitations to war, and he turned immediately, issuing low-voiced orders into his phone, Italian spelling fast and precise, names she didn't know, locations she'd never been allowed to visit, and Elena felt the walls closing in, the invisible machinery of his empire grinding into motion because of her, because someone had looked at her and decided to test him. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of controlled chaos, men arriving and leaving the penthouse without acknowledging her, scanning corridors, checking feeds, adjusting security protocols like the building itself had become a battlefield, and Matteo barely spoke to her, not out of neglect but because his attention had narrowed to a lethal point, and when he finally turned to her again, it was with a firmness that left no room for argument. You're not leaving today, he said, and she nodded, because she had learned that confinement was Matteo's version of protection, and yet something inside her bristled, a quiet rebellion she didn't voice, because she knew better. But as hours dragged on, Elena's thoughts churned, replaying the night of the charity event, every conversation, every glance, trying to remember if anyone had lingered too long, asked too many questions, and one face surfaced reluctantly in her memory, a man standing near the bar, well-dressed but not flashy, his smile easy, his eyes sharp in a way that made her uncomfortable, someone who hadn't flirted outright but had watched her like he was solving a puzzle, and she wondered, with a cold certainty, if he was the fire emoji, the photograph, the handwriting, and if so, what he wanted, because attention like that was never about admiration alone. By evening, Matteo finally sat beside her again, his hand covering hers, grounding but heavy, and she flinched before she could stop herself, earning a sharp look. I won't let anything happen to you, he said firmly, mistaking her fear for doubt, and she looked at him then, really looked, at the man who ruled half the city through fear and loyalty, who could make problems disappear with a phone call, and she realized the terrifying truth that Matteo's protection was also the reason she was in danger, because someone wasn't trying to take her, they were trying to provoke him through her, and that made her valuable in the worst possible way. Later that night, unable to sleep again, Elena wandered into Matteo's office, a space she rarely entered without permission, walls lined with books and city maps marked with subtle pins, the nerve center of his operations, and she didn't know what she was looking for exactly, maybe answers, maybe reassurance, but instead she found a second envelope on his desk, this one already opened, containing another photograph from a different angle, closer, more intimate, showing her leaning in slightly toward the man at the bar, laughing at something he'd said, a moment she barely remembered but that now felt damning, and beneath it was a note written in the same careful hand. You can lock the door, Matteo. She'll still be curious, and Elena's breath caught painfully in her chest, because the message wasn't just taunting, it was observant, as if the sender knew her thoughts better than Matteo did, and footsteps sounded behind her before she could process it, Matteo's reflection appearing in the glass, his expression dark and unreadable, and for the first time since she'd known him, Elena saw something flicker in his eyes that unsettled her more than anger ever could, doubt, not in his power, but in her, and as the silence stretched between them, thick and dangerous, Elena understood that the fire emoji had done more than attract attention, it had exposed a fracture in the foundation of her relationship with the most dangerous man in New York, and once a crack appeared, there was no telling how far it would spread. Elena felt the weight of the photographs and notes pressing on her chest like a physical force, the kind that made breathing shallow and thoughts scramble, because Matteo DeLuca had seen the first one, and now she knew without doubt that he had also seen the second, and he hadn't reacted outwardly yet, which terrified her more than rage ever could. His silence was a storm, coiled and patient, a storm that waited for the perfect moment to strike, and she had learned the hard way that when Matteo waited, consequences were absolute, irreversible, and final, and now she realized that the fire emoji, innocent as it had seemed, had triggered a chain of events she could no longer control, and as she stood in his office, the night pressing against the floor-to-ceiling windows like an audience, she watched Matteo slowly approach, hands in pockets, eyes fixed on her with that precise intensity that made her stomach tighten and her pulse race. Why didn't you tell me about him? he asked, voice low, smooth, but layered with a quiet threat that left no room for hesitation or deception, and she hesitated, searching for the right words. I didn't think it mattered, she admitted, because she hadn't understood the stakes, hadn't realized that in Matteo's world, small actions weren't small at all. They were signals, provocations, vulnerabilities, and as he circled her like a predator studying prey, Elena felt a strange mix of fear and adrenaline, because she knew he wasn't angry, not exactly, not yet, but he was assessing, calculating the potential threat, measuring it against every outcome he could foresee, and she felt helpless, because nothing in her life before had demanded this kind of obedience, this kind of awareness of every flicker of attention around her, every glance, every gesture, every subtle risk, and Matteo finally stopped in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, a physical pressure that reminded her of ownership, and he leaned down slightly, eyes locking with hers. Curiosity is dangerous, he said softly, almost a whisper, but she could hear the steel underneath, and she nodded, realizing the truth of it. That curiosity in her case wasn't innocent, it wasn't natural, it was a signal, a weakness that someone else could exploit, and Matteo's fingers brushed hers briefly as he handed back her phone. You will not respond, he said firmly, you will not acknowledge anything or anyone. Do you understand? And Elena's throat tightened as she murmured, yes, because there was no choice, not really, and the weight of that simple word settled like chains, reminding her that the world she now inhabited wasn't the one she had known before. It was a world where attention was dangerous, messages were weapons, and even a single emoji could ignite a war. Matteo straightened, his jaw tight, and Elena noticed the subtle change in his demeanor, the way his shoulders squared, his back rigid, a physical manifestation of control, and she knew he was already plotting, already tracing the origins of the photographs, the handwriting, the eyes that had watched her at the charity event, because Matteo didn't let things like this slide. He hunted them, dismantled them, made them vanish before they could become real problems, and she felt the vertigo of witnessing it, the realization that she was now inside a machine more intricate, more dangerous than she could ever have imagined, yet part of her, against every rational instinct, was fascinated, drawn to the precision, the absolute authority, the certainty in his movements. Hours passed as Matteo made calls, whispered in Italian, assigned tasks, and Elena moved like a ghost through the penthouse, half observing, half imagining what might happen if she misstepped, and as night deepened, she realized she hadn't eaten, hadn't even thought about food, because every nerve in her body was tuned to the tension radiating from him, and when Matteo finally allowed her to sit beside him, hand brushing hers again in that way that was both comfort and reminder of possession, he showed her a digital map, surveillance photos, and a dossier of everyone who had been near her at the charity event. I will find him, he said quietly, and when I do, you will not see it, but he will know why he should have stayed away. And Elena shivered, a mix of fear, admiration, and helplessness, because she realized she was powerless to stop him, yet also entirely at the center of everything, the pivot around which this storm rotated, and Matteo's eyes met hers then, softer now, but no less intense. You are mine, he said, the words carrying both promise and warning, and she nodded, because arguing was pointless, and yet her mind refused to rest, replaying every interaction, every glance from that night, analyzing, wondering, feeling the unfamiliar pull of excitement she couldn't name, a dangerous thrill that went against her fear but couldn't be separated from it. And as she finally retired to her bedroom hours later, the city lights casting long shadows through the drapes, she knew she was being watched, protected, claimed, and trapped, all at once, and sleep finally came only in fragments, dreams tangled with images of fire, shadows, and Matteo's eyes, and somewhere in the chaos of her mind, she realized with a sharp clarity that one fire emoji had done more than draw attention. It had rewritten her life, rewritten her understanding of love, power, and fear, and set in motion a confrontation she could feel creeping closer, inevitable, and she couldn't escape it, because in Matteo DeLuca's world, attention was a weapon, curiosity was a liability, and even a single spark could ignite a city of flames. The next morning, Elena awoke to the faint hum of the city beneath the penthouse, but the usual comfort of sunrise was gone, replaced by a tight knot in her chest that refused to loosen, because she knew Matteo DeLuca had already begun acting, silently, invisibly, while she had slept, tracing threads she couldn't see, dismantling risks she couldn't comprehend, and the weight of it pressed on her like a lead cloak, reminding her that in his world, even the smallest distraction could turn lethal. She dressed in silence, carefully choosing clothes that would not draw unnecessary attention, though she knew it mattered little, because Matteo's enemies had already learned that his associates carried his aura wherever they went, and she stepped into the kitchen to find him there, his eyes on her even before she fully entered, assessing, calculating, a predator reading signals only he could decipher, and the air between them vibrated with unspoken rules, boundaries set and enforced by his quiet intensity. "You slept well?" he asked, voice smooth, controlled, yet laced with something that made her stomach tighten, not entirely fear, not entirely desire, something that hovered in the dangerous space between, and she murmured a soft, cautious, yes, because truth in her tone mattered, even if the world they lived in had taught her how fragile truth could be. He nodded, seemingly satisfied, but she caught the shift in his jaw, the barely noticeable narrowing of his eyes, subtle enough that only someone who knew him intimately could read it, and she realized anew that every movement, every glance, every gesture mattered to him, and that meant her life had narrowed into the confines of his attention, a space simultaneously protective and suffocating. Breakfast was silent, the clink of cutlery punctuating the tension, and Elena felt herself drawn into the rhythm of observation, scanning for anomalies, watching the city below for threats she couldn't name, while Matteo's phone buzzed intermittently with messages he barely acknowledged aloud, his thumb flicking, swiping, delegating tasks that would remain invisible to the outside world, but whose consequences would ripple outward like controlled detonations, and when he finally spoke, it was calm, deliberate, carrying the weight of authority and inevitability. "I've identified him," he said, setting down his coffee, eyes locking on hers, "the man who sent the messages, the photos, the fire emoji. He's someone who underestimates me, or perhaps you, and that will cost him dearly." And Elena's pulse accelerated, a mixture of fear and anticipation tightening her chest, because the words were simple, matter of fact, but in Matteo's world, matter of fact was never ordinary, it was decisive, and she had no control, no ability to intervene, only to watch and obey. She followed him into his office later, where the walls were lined with monitors and maps, phones, and folders that formed a lattice of information she could never hope to fully understand, and he pointed to a screen showing a street she had walked down just days ago, the man in question caught on multiple angles, seemingly unaware of the forces moving to contain him, and Elena realized that the scale of Matteo's reach was terrifying, comprehensive, absolute, and for the first time, she saw the machinery of his power in action, relentless, precise, and designed to crush any who dared challenge it, even indirectly, and the thought made her shiver. Matteo's voice broke through her reverie, quiet but firm. "He doesn't know what he's stepped into," and she nodded, unable to form words that would capture the storm she felt inside, because she knew she was not just a witness but the center of it, the catalyst, and that made her heart beat faster with a thrill she did not fully understand, a dangerous excitement wrapped in terror, the kind of emotion only possible when power, danger, and attraction collided in ways that were impossible to separate. Hours passed as Matteo orchestrated moves she could only watch, calls, instructions, reassurances that he delivered with the calm precision of a man who had never failed, and Elena found herself moving through the penthouse like a shadow, tasting fear and anticipation, a constant tension vibrating through her limbs, aware that every sound could signal progress or peril, that every knock, every car horn, every distant voice might carry significance in the invisible chess game unfolding around her, and she felt simultaneously powerless and deeply implicated, knowing that she could not step aside, could not ignore what had begun with a single fire emoji. Night descended with heavy indifference, the city lights flickering like sparks from a distant fire, and Matteo finally allowed her to rest, drawing her close, hands firm, possessive, grounding, and Elena leaned into the weight of it, comfort and imprisonment fused together, feeling the electricity of proximity, the pulse of danger, the undeniable claim of a man whose control was total, who had declared her territory, and she trembled, not entirely from fear, but from the intensity of being so seen, so guarded, and so claimed. Sleep came fitfully, fragmented by dreams of fire, shadows, and the man she had blocked, glimpsed briefly at the charity event, always out of reach yet hauntingly present, and she woke at odd hours, heart racing, realizing that the world had shifted irreversibly, that a single emoji had escalated into surveillance, obsession, and silent war, and that Matteo's calm, lethal presence was both shield and warning, a promise that no threat would go unanswered, and that she was inextricably bound to the storm. In the quiet hours before dawn, Elena sat by the window, staring out at the city, the skyline a mix of gold and steel, and she understood with stark clarity that nothing would ever be simple again, that her life had been rewritten, that one tiny act, one fleeting digital spark, had become a beacon, drawing danger, power, and desire into a vortex she could not escape, and she realized, finally, that fire, once ignited, cannot be easily controlled, and she was already in its path. Elena woke to the pale light of dawn filtering through the drapes, but the calm of morning was a lie, a thin veil over the tension that had settled in her chest like a living thing, coiling, waiting, because Matteo DeLuca had already been awake, already moving, already preparing for a confrontation she could neither predict nor prevent, and even though she had grown used to his methods, to the quiet violence of control and precision, the reality of it never failed to unsettle her, the way his mind worked like a machine, calculating every angle, predicting every outcome, and she realized, with a chill, that the fire emoji had not been just a message, it had been a spark that lit an entire network of consequences that now revolved around her. Matteo emerged from his bedroom silently, impeccably dressed even in the early light, eyes scanning her as though measuring her heartbeat against his own, and she felt the old mix of fear and thrill, a tension that had become her constant companion, and when he spoke, his voice low, deliberate, "We need to leave," she nodded instantly, knowing better than to question him, and the air in the penthouse shifted, charged with urgency, as his men moved in and out, a silent army in service to his strategy, securing exits, checking cameras, ensuring that nothing escaped their control, and Elena felt the magnitude of being at the center of such a well-oiled machine, a woman whose life was entwined with power she could barely comprehend, a chess piece and a prize at once. The car ride through Manhattan was quiet except for the hum of the engine and the occasional instruction Matteo gave over a secure phone line, and Elena's mind raced with questions she could not ask, scanning every street, every pedestrian, every detail, trying to guess the identity of the man who had started this, the one whose attention had triggered an entire city's worth of calculation, and she felt the weight of her own complicity, the way simply existing in Matteo's orbit made her both safe and vulnerable, desired and endangered, and the paradox made her chest ache. They arrived at a nondescript building, one of Matteo's safe houses, and Elena realized with a tightening stomach that this was not a meeting, not a simple precaution, but an operation, a step into action, and she had no idea what role she would play, if any, beyond being present, observed, and protected, and as Matteo led her through the reinforced doors, she saw men in suits, in tactical gear, assembling quickly, quietly, like shadows ready to strike, and she felt both fear and a perverse awe, because the scale of preparation was overwhelming, yet precise, meticulous, and she understood, even as her heart thumped painfully, that she was witnessing the inner workings of a world few had ever seen, where information, timing, and control were as lethal as any weapon. Matteo handed her a coffee, his fingers brushing hers briefly, grounding her, reminding her that in the chaos, she was claimed, and she took it, hands slightly trembling, knowing that the touch carried both comfort and warning, and he gestured for her to sit in a chair near the monitors, where she could observe without interfering, and she obeyed, feeling simultaneously invisible and central, a paradox she had grown used to but still found unnerving. The screens displayed a mixture of surveillance feeds, photographs, and real-time tracking of the man who had sent the emoji and photographs, and Elena watched as Matteo's team dissected every movement, every connection, plotting a path that would leave him with no options, a web closing in without a trace, and she felt her stomach twist, because even though no one in the room raised a gun, the tension was palpable, a kind of silent threat that seeped into her bones, making her pulse quicken with both fear and fascination. Matteo moved among his men with a calm authority that demanded attention and obedience, issuing orders that were precise, concise, unchallengeable, and Elena noticed how effortlessly the room responded, how the gears of his empire turned smoothly under his command, and she realized, again, that this man, whom she had learned to love in fragments of safety and passion, was also a force of nature, unstoppable, and terrifyingly focused when someone dared challenge him through her. Hours passed in this controlled chaos, screens flickering, phones buzzing, maps shifting, and Elena remained seated, absorbing everything, sensing the unspoken rules, the lethal choreography, the quiet promise that anyone who crossed the line would face consequences, and a part of her wondered if the fire emoji sender even realized what he had provoked, whether he understood that by reaching for her, he had invited a storm, a methodical, unrelenting force of power and precision, and whether he would survive even a single encounter with it. Night fell over the city again, but the safe house remained illuminated, a hive of movement and strategy, and Elena's attention never wavered from the monitors, from the maps, from Matteo's calm, commanding presence, a man who carried both reassurance and menace in every movement, and she realized that her own emotions mirrored the chaos around her, a mix of fear, fascination, and an unnameable pull toward a man who could destroy and protect with equal ease. When Matteo finally leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples briefly, Elena allowed herself a small breath, though it was shaky, because even in pause, she could sense the potential energy, the promise of action that could erupt at any moment, and she knew that this night was just a prelude, the calm before a storm she could not predict, and she understood, with a chilling clarity, that the fire emoji had not been just a message, not just a spark, but a signal that had unleashed the full force of Matteo DeLuca's world, and that her life was now inseparable from it. Caught in the orbit of power, danger, and obsession, she moved to the window, staring down at the city lights like sparks against darkness, and realized that nothing could undo the chain reaction she had set in motion, that every step she had taken, every glance, every interaction was now part of a larger pattern, a web in which she was central, and as Matteo's hand rested briefly on her shoulder, grounding yet possessive, she understood fully that the fire emoji had done more than attract attention, it had rewritten her existence, setting her on a path from which there was no turning back, and that the consequences were only beginning to unfold, silently, inevitably, and she was trapped in the beautiful, terrifying power of it all. The next day dawned gray and heavy over Manhattan, the clouds low, reflecting Elena's mood, though she tried to keep a calm exterior, because living under Matteo DeLuca's protection meant projecting composure even when her heart was a storm of fear, anticipation, and a strange, unnameable thrill, and as she moved through the penthouse, adjusting her clothing, checking her phone for any anomalies, she felt the weight of yesterday's events pressing on her, the realization that she was now fully entangled in a chain of actions that could spiral out of control at any second, all beginning with a single fire emoji, small, innocent, but capable of igniting a storm she could barely comprehend. Matteo appeared in the kitchen as she poured coffee, his presence immediate, silent, commanding, and Elena felt the familiar tightening in her chest, that mix of fear and attraction that had become her constant companion, and he regarded her with the same intensity he had yesterday, calm yet sharp, measuring every detail, reading her like a book she could never close, and when he spoke, it was with a quiet authority that left no room for hesitation. "We move today," he said simply, and she nodded, knowing not to ask questions, because in his world, questions were distractions, and distractions were dangerous, particularly when someone had already crossed lines she could not even begin to measure. The drive through the city was silent except for Matteo's low instructions over the phone, his thumb flicking over messages, coordinating actions that Elena could only watch, mesmerized and terrified, the city passing by like a blur of steel and glass, unaware that one man's empire was moving with precision to neutralize a threat she could barely imagine, and she realized that the man who had sent the emoji and photographs had no idea the scale of what he had triggered, that by reaching for her, he had unknowingly stepped into the orbit of a man who would dismantle threats like clockwork, invisible but inevitable, and she felt a shiver run through her as she considered the danger she herself represented in his eyes, central to the unfolding operation, vital to both target and protector. They arrived at a nondescript building, one of Matteo's safe houses, and Elena's stomach tightened as she followed him through reinforced doors, past men in tactical gear who moved with silent efficiency, the air thick with focus, and she realized anew how powerless she was in this world, yet also how central she had become, because every precaution, every movement, every surveillance feed revolved around her presence, her safety, her visibility, and the risk she carried simply by existing in Matteo's orbit. Inside, the screens flickered with surveillance feeds, maps, photographs, tracking movements of the man who had sent the emoji, the images crisp, precise, the angles revealing, and Elena watched as Matteo orchestrated his team, issuing orders in low, controlled Italian, his movements decisive, unhesitating, and she felt a mix of awe and fear, because the machinery of his power was breathtaking, lethal in its precision, and she understood that he would not allow this threat to persist, that he would eradicate it quietly, absolutely, and invisibly, and that realization made the fire emoji feel like a fuse in a room filled with dynamite, small but capable of devastating consequence. Hours passed with Elena absorbing the rhythm of Matteo's operations, the meticulous tracking, the careful, calculated communication with his men, and she felt both helpless and strangely exhilarated, because being at the center of such power was terrifying, but also intoxicating, a dangerous intimacy with a man who could destroy worlds without leaving a trace, and she understood, more vividly than ever, that her role was not just as a witness, but as a symbol, a point of leverage, a catalyst, and that every step she had taken before now had led to this moment of absolute observation and silent tension. Matteo finally leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples briefly, eyes catching hers across the room, and for a brief moment, the air shifted, a subtle acknowledgement that she was both claimed and protected, central and vulnerable, a paradox that weighed heavily on her heart, and she felt the strange, dangerous pull of being so intensely observed and cared for by a man who was both her savior and her cage, whose calm authority was both reassurance and warning, and whose presence was as inescapable as it was intoxicating. When night fell, the city's lights spilling gold and silver across the skyline, Elena remained at the monitors, drawn to the screens, the maps, the images that charted the man's movements, feeling a quiet thrill at the meticulous dismantling of threats she could barely comprehend, and a deeper terror at realizing how small she was in comparison, how reliant, how dangerously enmeshed, yet unable to look away, unable to step out of the orbit she had entered with a single emoji that had seemed harmless, fleeting, trivial. Matteo's hand rested lightly on her shoulder, grounding, possessive, and Elena leaned into it, feeling the strange fusion of fear and desire, control and surrender, because she knew that in his world, protection came with possession, and that every ounce of safety was wrapped in layers of intensity she could neither escape nor resist, and she understood fully that she was trapped in a balance of power and passion, danger and devotion, where a single spark could ignite everything, where every move was consequential, and where the fire emoji had become the key that unlocked a world she could not leave. As she finally allowed herself to sit back, breathing shallow, watching the city flicker below, Elena realized that her life had been rewritten irrevocably, that curiosity, attention, and attraction had collided in a single, perfect storm, and that Matteo's calm, decisive, unrelenting presence was both her shield and her warning, the central force in a reality she had never anticipated, and she understood, with stark clarity, that the fire emoji was not the beginning of the story, but the spark that had ignited a chain of events that would define her existence, her fears, and her desires for everything that followed, and that from this moment on, she was caught completely in the orbit of Matteo DeLuca, a world of power, danger, and passion from which there would be no escape. The city stretched below the penthouse like a field of lights, indifferent to the chaos that had begun with something as small as a fire emoji, and Elena sat by the window, the envelope from the previous day still tucked under her arm, knowing that nothing about her life would ever be the same again, because Matteo DeLuca had transformed every glance, every message, every fleeting interaction into a matter of power, protection, and obsession, and she understood, more clearly than ever, that she was at the center of a world designed to move silently, decisively, without witnesses, where consequences were absolute and irreversible, and where her very presence could trigger events that might ripple far beyond her understanding. Matteo moved beside her, quiet but ever present, his shadow falling over her as he scanned the city, and she felt the familiar mix of fear and desire that had become the rhythm of their days, the pull of a man whose calm authority was both comforting and suffocating, whose hands could protect or claim, whose mind could dismantle threats with surgical precision, and whose attention was a force she could neither resist nor escape, and she realized that every beat of her heart had been claimed, mapped, and measured, just as every move of the man who had sent the fire emoji had now been tracked, analyzed, and neutralized in ways she could only glimpse from the edges of Matteo's operation. The morning passed in a tense silence, punctuated only by Matteo's occasional low instructions over a secure line, his eyes never leaving the monitors that displayed the city, the movement of people, the unseen threads of power and danger that he manipulated so effortlessly, and Elena felt herself swept up in the rhythm of observation, her pulse sink to the quiet, lethal cadence of a world that was invisible to everyone else, yet central to her existence, her fears, and her desires, and she realized, with a chill, that the fire emoji had not been a simple gesture but the catalyst for an irreversible transformation, a spark that had ignited a web of influence and obsession from which she could not disentangle herself. Matteo finally leaned back in his chair, glancing at her with an intensity that made her stomach tighten, a look that was both possessive and protective, warning and reassurance, and Elena understood that in his mind, every action he took, every decision he made, revolved around her safety, her loyalty, and the assertion of his control over anything that dared to intrude, and she felt both secure and trapped, a paradox that was at once terrifying and intoxicating, because she knew that no one else could navigate this world, and yet she could never truly leave it, having already become central to the forces at play, the pivot around which threats and protection alike now rotated. The hours passed as she watched, silent and alert, absorbing every movement, every subtle shift in Matteo's expression, every update on the monitor. monitors, feeling the electric tension of anticipation as his team worked with quiet precision to dismantle the remnants of the threat, and she realized that the man who had sent the emoji, the photographs, and the notes had underestimated not only Matteo's reach but the way he transformed perceived danger into a controlled, invisible counterstrike, and that realization filled her with both awe and a deep, unsettling fear, because the storm of power around her was immense, inevitable, and inescapable, and she was now an inseparable part of it, the axis on which it turned. Night descended with slow inevitability, the skyline a tapestry of light and shadow, and Matteo finally allowed himself a brief pause, moving to stand behind her, hands resting lightly on her shoulders, grounding yet possessive, and Elena leaned into the weight of it, feeling the mixture of comfort and warning, desire and fear, and she understood, fully and finally, that her life was no longer her own, that the fire emoji had set in motion a chain of events that bound her to a man whose world was as dangerous as it was captivating, and whose claim over her was absolute, in ways that were both thrilling and terrifying, because safety and captivity were inseparable in Matteo's orbit. She turned her head slightly to look up at him, catching the dark intensity in his eyes, the quiet certainty, the lethal calm that had dismantled threats before she had even realized they existed, and she realized that she was not just protected but marked, that her presence alone had become a symbol of his power, and the thought sent a shiver through her, a mixture of fear, excitement, and helpless surrender, because she knew there was no escaping what had begun with a single emoji, no retreat from the path that had been laid out by her existence in his world. The phone buzzed once on the desk, and Matteo's attention shifted instantly, every muscle tightening, and Elena watched as he handled the call with calm authority, delegating tasks, issuing silent instructions, and ensuring that the man who had tried to provoke them was fully aware, though from a distance, that crossing Matteo DeLuca came at a cost, and she marveled, horrified and entranced, at the precision, the power, the silent inevitability of his response, and she understood that she was witnessing, and living inside, the mechanics of a man who commanded not only loyalty but fear, respect, and absolute control, and that she herself had become the axis of that operation, a living, breathing part of the strategy, the threat, and the protection. As midnight approached, Elena finally allowed herself a moment to breathe, leaning against Matteo as he stood beside her, eyes scanning the city, calm, unwavering, and she realized that the fire emoji, trivial and fleeting in its own moment, had rewritten her life completely, had drawn her into a vortex of power, obsession, and desire from which there was no escape, and that the man she had thought of as a protector was also her captor in the most exquisite and terrifying sense, a presence that both shielded her and claimed her, bound her and defined her, and she understood that the line between fear and fascination, safety and surrender, love and possession, had been erased by something as simple, as small, and as inevitable as a fire emoji. The city slept below, unaware of the storm that had been unleashed above, unaware that one simple act had ignited a sequence of events that would define not just one life, but the course of power, obsession, and control in Matteo DeLuca's world, and Elena felt, finally, the totality of what had been set in motion, the inevitability of her entanglement, and the undeniable truth that she was now inseparable from the man who had claimed her, whose calm, lethal, and absolute authority had transformed fear into protection, curiosity into danger, and a single emoji into a chain of events that would shape every moment of their lives from this point forward, forever binding her to a world of fire, control, and desire that she could neither resist nor escape.